Salam Lin, you posed a really important question. If you are able to not start your video, then your video will not be recorded, or none of us would be able to see it.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. We are going to start with the recitation of the Quran and a land acknowledgement that Zainab is going to deliver. Over to you, Zainab. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazat. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. I begin by acknowledging that Allah created humanity in and of this earth as her Khalifa, and this land that we're on has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We can never work to end systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of indigenous folks in our collective decision-making for social justice and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from the colonization and genocide of the indigenous people of this land. Therefore, in order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Make which. And now I'll pass it to Iman to go over the housekeeping rules.
Thank you, Zainab. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So first, we please ask everyone to be respectful. We invite your comments and questions, and we'll run a live Q&A session at the end of the seminar using the chat box, or you can also use the Q&A function on your screen to put your questions in. Please contribute to the Q&A session with an open mind and heart. Use I statements, and consider the Q&A session a dialogue, not a debate. Actively listen, and we will also be sending out a post-event survey via email to you later today. So it will take about 5 minutes to complete, and we'd really appreciate it if you can complete that for us. If you experience any technical difficulties, please feel free to join us via our live stream on our Facebook page, our CCMW National Facebook page. Thank you.
I believe that the next part was going to be delivered by Nina, and she is up north. So I don't know if she's having internet problems. We haven't heard from her. So in the interest of time, I will continue. So I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Nuzhat Jaffrey. I'm the executive director. Oh, there's Nina. Okay, so I'll stop. Walaikum assalam, Nina. Over to you. You're telling everybody about the series. Go ahead, Nina.
Sorry about that. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can you hear me, Nuzhat?
Yes.
We can hear you. We can hear you, but we can't see you. So you might
I'm unable to start the video. I'm so sorry. I
No,
want
no.
to welcome all of you to our session of CCMW's Women's Scholars Series. For the past 39 years, almost 40 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are based on different topics related to Muslim women. We're looking forward to presenting these seminars for many more months, inshallah. And I will pass the baton on to the next person. Nuzhat, I'm sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe it's me. So I have the pleasure of introducing you to our presenter this evening. So welcome, Arij. Arij Elmy will be presenting. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a social worker and a PhD candidate in social justice education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She has an appointment in the School of Social Work at McMaster University. She received her Bachelor and Master of Social Work from the University of Windsor. She went on to work as a women's self-defense instructor. Maybe you can teach us a few things, Arij, with Wendo Women's Self-Defense, and served as a research associate with the Sexual Assault Resistance Education Center. Her clinical work focused on crisis mental health and child and family counseling. Arij has training in emotion-focused therapy and emotion-focused family therapy. Her research and writing is informed by a decolonial Black feminist approach and has so far focused on Islamophobia and the intersections between race, religion, and violence. Over to you, Arij.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And mashallah, I love the teamwork. You were all so smooth in passing the baton. So thank you for that. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So hopefully you're able to see that. Yeah. Sister Nuzhat, could you confirm that you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. Okay. Now let me just, organize my notes. Okay, I'm toggling between two screens. So thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay, so I know that Sister Zainab did a land acknowledgement, but I built one into my talk. So I am going to do another one. And then I'm going to reflect on why it's so important for us as Muslim Canadians, why we have that as a practice. So I'm here in Hamilton, Ontario. So please reflect on the traditional territory that you're currently on as I share mine. So the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So as Muslims, it's important for us to reflect on the legacy of colonialism here in Canada. It's especially important because the logics that were used to colonize this land and these people were developed and used to create Muslims as a problem. So we must always consider the ways that our knowledge systems, our ways of knowing, are shaped by the legacy of colonialism and the linkages that exist between anti-Muslim hostility and anti-indigeneity here in Canada. So with that said, I'd like to introduce myself, and mashallah, Sister Nushat already did, but I'll just repeat. My name is Arij Elmy. I'm a social worker and a PhD candidate at OISE at the University of Toronto. I have an appointment at the School of Social Work at McMaster, where I teach and do my research. And what I'm sharing this evening is part of my doctoral thesis, where I used therapeutic apologies with young Muslim women in Canada. So my project was informed by my work as a psychotherapist and social worker, working with young Muslim women. So I'm going to share a bit about the journey of how I came to this project and what I learned as a result of interviewing 17 young Muslim women about their experiences with this therapeutic tool. Okay, so we're going to start with background. So hopefully that's switching for you all. All right, so now more than ever, there is attention to this thing that we call Muslim mental health. So there are conferences, including the annual Canadian Muslim Mental Health Conference, and networks of research and support, including the Institute for Muslim Mental Health. So Muslim mental health has grown exponentially as a topic of research since 9/11. People want to understand Muslim well-being and how mental health relates to our social and economic integration, our response to government surveillance, our voting practices, among other things. So it's not that Muslim mental health is new. We have a lot of evidence from Islamic history that suggests both scholars and lay people paid attention to emotional and social well-being. What is new about Muslim mental health is the central role that mental health and psychology now play in our systems of morality. So I want you to consider the following quote from Cyrus Zargar, who examines virtue ethics from Ghazali and other medieval scholars. So he says, quote, "Modern psychology so informs our way of thinking that we have difficulty noticing it humming in the background of our assessments of self and others. Every time we, as Americans or Westerners, think of a moral action as unhealthy, we speak in psychological terms. Moreover, phrases such as Freudian slip, inner child, anal retentive, acting out, or OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, have become a part of everyday English, even if such usage often does not conform to the phrase's scientific meaning. So psychology is, after all, for many moderns, so that's us, an important, if not the most important standard of measurement for the well-being of the human mind and in many ways, life as a whole." So what this quote so elegantly demonstrates is that our ideas of mental health, well-being, and psychology have reshaped the ways that we communicate and understand what is right and what is wrong. So whether we participate directly in psychotherapy or not, our very familiarity with all of those terms that we just listed tells us something about the ways that we assess and understand one another. So as Muslims, we are a part of that shift. And this shift is therapeutic culture, which denotes the centrality of psychology in our systems of morality, now becoming the dominant way that we know ourselves, know each other, and determine what is right and what is wrong. So my entry into this conversation of Muslim mental health is then a query into the ways that psychology interacts with a different moral system, a moral system of Muslimness, how we relate to Islam. So our current conceptualization of Muslim mental health would suggest that there is a perfect application between Muslim and mental health. So if we add blue and yellow, we get green. Another model, and that's the second one there, and many of us are familiar with this one, is the idea that Muslim and mental health are incompatible. So there is an either or. There's no potential for fruitful interaction or relationship between the two. So I disagree with the second model, as I believe there is utility in modern and Western notions of mental health, even though we recognize that much of modern psychology was designed with whiteness as the norm and applied in ways that pathologize historically other categories of being, including Muslimness and Blackness, among others. So I'm more interested in the ways that Muslimness and mental health interact together as systems of morality. So as you see here in the third model, that Muslimness and mental health are both transformed into something new. So they don't retain their color in that third segment. They overlap, but they are distinct and newly created in particular ways. So some of the questions that I consider broadly in my research is, what is Muslimness, right? So often Muslimness is reduced to an identity or to a set of practices, such as the 5 pillars that we engage in. But there's a lot of literature that argues that Muslimness is always in tension with other frameworks, other schemas. And these can include nationalism, neoliberalism, pan-Islamist politics, you name it. So if the dominant framework of understanding in our current moment is therapeutic culture, which again, we're using to denote the centrality of psychology in our ways of knowing and systems of morality, how is Muslimness as a framework then reshaped when it encounters therapeutic culture? So secondly, I'm interested in what Muslimness does to therapeutic culture, because I understand the relationship between the two as being a two-way street. There's a lot of research that looks at the ways that therapeutic approaches are translated into contexts such as Mexico and China. However, I'm not interested in understanding how something gets to be translated, which suggests that there is coherence or stability across contexts. Rather, I want to understand what happens to the thing itself, right? So in this case, being therapeutic culture, when Muslimness gets introduced. So now, as Muslims are participating more and more in this thing, what happens to psychology? What happens to therapeutic culture? This way of understanding the self. And my hunch is that Muslimness is in some ways also going to transform therapeutic culture through that interaction. So the rest of my questions, again, just really focuses on the relation between the two, proposing that something happens to both Muslimness and therapeutic culture as a result of their encounter. Okay, so for my particular project, I decided to use a therapeutic tool called Therapeutic Apologies. I wanted to see if it could help me answer those bigger questions that I just presented to you. So a bit of background on Therapeutic Apologies. Therapeutic apologies were first developed for use in emotion-focused therapy. And with the support of a psychotherapist, couples who had had some kind of injury happen between them, some kind of emotional harm, would be supported by their psychotherapist in constructing an apology and delivering it, and the other party receiving it from that person. And this again would relate to incidents where there was a lingering feeling of anger, hurt, sadness, or some other intense emotion. So that was the interpersonal version of the apology, because it took place between two individuals, the apologizer and the person receiving the apology. And the objective of that apology was to heal the relationship. So the developers of emotion-focused family therapy then redeveloped therapeutic apologies for parents who had children who had a disordered eating. So the developers found that with the combination of therapeutic apologies, emotional coaching, and behavioral coaching, parents could decrease their own feelings of self-blame and fear and increase their feelings of self-efficacy. So that's their confidence in doing things. And that particular combination contributed to their children having lowered symptoms of disordered eating and also lowered symptoms of depression and anxiety. So it had a real effect for a very difficult to treat population, by the way. And this was true for children across the lifespan, including adult children. So parents who engaged in that process really saw those positive impacts for children of any age. So in addition to the interpersonal version of the therapeutic apology that I first outlined, both emotion-focused and emotion-focused family therapy developed what they call a unilateral variant. So that's for situations where it's not ideal to involve another party in an apology. It might be unsafe, or there might be risk for you being re-injured by the person apologizing to you. So the goal of unilateral forgiveness, that unilateral therapeutic apology, is not to heal the relationship, but rather to address any strong lingering emotions that are still remaining from some type of emotional injury that happened previously. So again, kind of as I said earlier, it's important to note that the majority of research on psychology in general, and it's true for therapeutic apologies as well, has been on white middle-class individuals. So my attention to Muslim participants was a new direction for research on this particular subject. So again, this version of therapeutic apologies, the unilateral version, requires perspective taking and apologizing to yourself regarding an earlier emotional injury. So the steps of the apology are outlined for you here on this screen. And there is a guide that I developed with the support of the Hurmur Project and the Tessellate Institute. So if you go to projectapology.com, you'll also receive some information, I understand, after this seminar on how to, get to this website and learn more. You can download the guide and you can read about it as you decide whether it is a process that makes sense for you, because again, it is a very emotionally evocative process, as you can imagine. So very briefly, the process involves writing a letter from the perspective of a parent in this case, a parent who has emotionally injured you. In the letter, there's a specific formulation that you want to follow. You want to name the injury. And by the way, that injury can be big or small. It just has to be something that sort of stayed with you and causes you some emotional, feeling. Secondly, you want to validate the emotions that it caused. So you can say things like, you must have felt so sad, you must have felt so alone. It's really deepening and noticing those feelings that are attached to that injury. Then you want to acknowledge the impact of the injury and the emotions. So how has that injury continued to show up for you in the present? And then lastly, you're going to say what will or could have been done differently. So here you're really using your imagination and thinking about, the best part of your parent and what they could or perhaps can do differently in the future. So yeah, so this is a room, it's actually wellness therapy. And it's a room similar to where I met my participants when they were engaging with this process. So after writing the letter, the next step is to read the letter to an empty chair. So again, you're engaging with your imagination. So as you sit across from the empty chair, you're imagining yourself at whatever age that emotional injury would have been taking place. And then you read it out loud to that imagined you. So when I facilitated this process with the participants, I sat in a third chair and I acted as a witness for the individual who was going through that process. And we sat together as they wrote the letter, as they imagined themselves in the chair, and then as they read their letter out loud. So as for this particular study, it was smaller. it was more of an exploratory, again, just to understand it's a new population. We've never used this process with. How might they make sense of it? You know, how useful might they find it? That was sort of the guiding questions. So I had 17 young women participate across 2 study sites in Montreal and in Toronto. And the women ranged in ages and ethnicities, with about 40% identifying as Black and the other 60% identifying as South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, or Arab. So as a group, the participants were well educated. 15 out of the 17 had at least a bachelor degree or more. And they were quite familiar with psychotherapy. I think that's what attracted them perhaps to participating in the study. So more than 2/3 had either participated in therapy at that time or had participated previously. So some of the injuries that came up in their letter, so some of the things that they, sort of wanted to pay attention to were included. They were very serious, let me say that. Some related to physical abuse, including hair pulling, being slapped, being forcibly confined to a room. Emotional abuse included being told that they were going to hell, or being put down verbally. So I would characterize most of the injuries that they described as being emotional. And participants would explain that, their parents fed them, clothed them, housed them, but they also really invalidated their feelings. They made them feel bad as children for having feelings, and continued as adults as well, actually. Some parents were not equipped to handle disclosures from their children, including, one participant shared that she told her, mother she had been sexually abused as a child, and, her mother just didn't handle it well. So that later became an injury that she needed to work through. Some of the participants shared that they couldn't, be their full selves with their parents, so they couldn't tell them that they were queer, for example, which left them feeling really isolated and alone. And participants shared that they largely did not feel understood by their parents, while they were simultaneously expected to understand their parents and really made to feel responsible for doing so. And that's a tension that showed up quite a bit. Okay, so having introduced the process of therapeutic apologies and the young women who participated in the study, we can return to that earlier question that I posed of how do we understand Muslimness and therapeutic culture, and how might they influence one another? So firstly, let's discuss how the young Muslim women understood therapeutic culture, both as it related to the process that they engaged with, which was the therapeutic apology, as well as their everyday life, which they referenced as part of the interview. So we, did the therapeutic apology together, with my support, and then we talked about it. And then we also talked about how it related, to their everyday life. So therapeutic culture was really at the center of how the young women understood the injuries that they talked about and their processes of healing. So therapeutic culture showed up in 3 particular frames. First, there was an ability to engage with a painful past, right? So they really, really talked a lot about that, which they viewed as evidence of their healing, or that they were starting to heal. And they also talked about an ability, or at least a desire, to stop intergenerational cycles of familial abuse, which they used to distinguish themselves from parents who perpetuated a cycle. And then lastly, there was an ability to speak for themselves and do differently, which they used to differentiate from a childhood self who couldn't speak. So I have a few examples that I'm going to walk us through. So again, as I mentioned, the majority of the young women had participated in some psychotherapy, either at that time or in the past. And many of them used, their participation in therapy to demarcate a present self, so one who is healing, from one who was, they would use words like, walking in the, lost, things like that. So here, for example, Fatima explains, and I'll read the quote. So something traumatic happened to me as an adult, and all of this stuff from my past came out at that time. And it was just a nightmare, because I was having flashbacks of childhood. And I was just like, my life is hell. Like I was in so much PTSD at that time, 8 years ago. I didn't have anything to grab onto. Like I wouldn't have been able to write this letter. I probably wouldn't have been able to put it all down at that time. So for Fatima and for others, an ability to speak about and make meaning of what happened was really central to their healing process, even though, as she says here, and others also said, that healing process, remains incomplete and requires further intervention. But there was at a time where, as she says, she couldn't even do what she had done, which was write this letter and read it out loud. So it really was evidence for her of something. Okay. Another key way that therapeutic culture worked as a logic was through a need to differentiate oneself as someone who could stop a cycle of abuse in comparison to parents who were also victims of earlier abuses, but continued to be perpetrators of an ongoing cycle. So for example, Jasmine, another of the participants, and these are all pseudonyms, by the way, explains. So instead of being, woe is me, and why is this happening, and why is this always happening, I can take some agency over that and the responsibility I should be taking to do that difficult work inside of me, because I can't get to the other side of that rainbow. What's there for me until I do that. I don't want to repeat the same cycle. I want to do better for my kids or my nephews or the next generation. So yeah, it's important to note here that, Jasmine didn't have children at that point. And the majority of the participants were, not married, did not have children, but would often make reference to future children as a motivation for, again, wanting to heal and wanting to use these logics of therapy to overcome something that their parents had been unable to. So Jasmine and several of the other participants viewed themselves as being responsible for stopping a cycle of abuse. They internalized this responsibility and really understood their parents as lacking the tools and resources to do better. So they were able to hold this contradictory idea together, both that they could do differently by doing some internal work, but also understanding that that work would be ongoing and it would be endless. So lastly, a logic of therapeutic culture that was really present for the young Muslim women was an expectation that they could relate to their childhood self by proving that they could do now what they could not do then. So for example, Idil explains, she's talking here about her mother. When you don't heal, and this is what I know for sure as a woman today, when you don't heal, you are triggered by things that you didn't have the time to analyze from other angles. And I think that's the luxury my mom did not have. As a single mom, you are managing crises. You don't have time and energy to just sit back and think about your situation, think about your children's situation. So you're just reactive and reacting to everything. And that's what I know about my experience with my mom. She was just reacting to everything. And in her reactions, she would invalidate my feelings. Sometimes, she would just say very horrible things, but that's her pain talking. But as a kid, you don't care to know that. You don't care to understand that. And you shouldn't understand that. As an adult, I understand it. As an adult, I don't allow it. So what's so poignant about Idil's quote, is the distinction that she's making between her adult self and her childhood self. And this was a resource and a distinction that many of the participants made. So her childhood self didn't care to understand. And as an adult, she defends that and says that, yeah, her childhood self shouldn't have to understand, you know, even if she did at that time. As an adult, she can recognize the dynamics that were existing in that earlier home. And she is enforcing particular boundaries to ensure that those earlier injuries, such as her feelings being invalidated, do not continue. So, in summary to this section, the ways that the young women were able to use logics of therapeutic culture included distinguishing themselves from earlier selves that were disempowered. They became empowered by distinguishing themselves against parents who could not stop the cycle, earlier selves who lacked a meaning-making system and were thus unsure of how to heal, and childhood selves who were made to understand what they should not have. What's more interesting is that those mechanisms of therapeutic culture really became ways for the young women to clarify how they arrived at adulthood. So they distinguished themselves from parents who came from very different cultural systems and entered adulthood through more traditional conventions, such as marriage and having children. The majority of participants, as I already said, were unmarried and viewed their entry into adulthood as resulting from their ability to engage with a painful past, address intergenerational cycles of familial abuse, and speak to a childhood self and do differently. So this is not to say that therapeutic culture is causing us as Muslim women to get married later or to get married less, but rather it is to suggest that therapeutic culture is really key to the way that we as Muslim women now conceptualize adulthood and our entry into that period of life. To kind of further support that point, I have an example here coming again from Idil, who's talking about her relationship with her mother. So Idil received a very painful story from her mom. Her mom had explained to her, you know, that she regretted having children. And so for Idil, as one of those children who had a very difficult childhood, it was very painful to receive this admission from her mom. So Idil shares in this quote that her response to her mother's admission told her something about herself. So she says, "I really thought it was her story. And you know, when people ask you, when did you know that you became an adult? Or when did you know that you became a woman? I knew that I was a woman in that moment because I could receive something that was very, very harming for me as a child, but as a woman, not at all. So I knew I was grown. I knew." So again, Idil distinguishes what would have felt disempowering for her as a child from what she now feels empowered to negotiate and to relate to differently. So the majority of the women similarly outlined a period in which they became an adult by using a therapeutic logic rather than, again, those conventional logics of adulthood, including marriage, children, leaving the parental home, etc. So it's important to note, and I really want to iterate this, that the adulthood that therapeutic culture provides is very precarious and incomplete. So the participants described the work that they had to continue doing. There's an ongoing engagement with both formal and informal therapeutic resources that allowed them to progress towards an adulthood that they recognize they may never fully achieve. So we can see this in the language that they use to describe the inner work that they were continuing to do. So this is on the left column. So there's a lot of work that I don't know how to do. It's a work in progress. I've done so much work and yet. And I think that third one really captures so much of what, these young women were saying. They participate in therapy, they're reading psychological texts, they're talking the lingo, and it still feels like I haven't arrived, right? So it's again that precarious and incompleteness of adulthood. This was in contrast to their parents, who were understood to not engage the logics of therapeutic culture. So it was quite frequent in the interviews to hear the participants describe their parents as emotionally stunted or underdeveloped. And this gap they credited to the fact that their parents were not exposed to therapeutic culture and the logic such as vulnerability, talking about feelings and things like that. So in one poignant quote, a participant describes the resources that her father never got to use. And she says, this is the second quote on the right, "He has no empty chair to speak to. He never had any therapy. He never had any outlet, no yoga for him." So as the young women engage with and identify themselves with those logics of therapeutic culture, they simultaneously understand how their parents lack access to even get started. So they understand it as being, an issue of perhaps social justice, that they sort of were never given the words to then say later on. Okay, so shifting gears from therapeutic culture now to Muslimness. And actually, I'll take a sip of water if you don't mind. All right. So our next subject of focus was, how was Muslimness understood by the young Muslim women, particularly in the context of therapeutic apologies and therapeutic culture more broadly? So there were three main ways that they conceptualized Muslimness. It was through a rewriting of Islamic histories and futures, so producing scripts that better included them. They destabilized hierarchies in order to include queer and trans Muslims. And finally, they spoke for God and created new origin stories, new cosmogonies that reflected those hierarchies that they were producing. Okay, so again, it's a longer quote, but I thought to share them so you get a flavor of, what participants were sharing. So here, Reem is reflecting on the ways that parenting is really talked about during khutbahs and just in general at the mosque. So here's the quote. So that one saying that like Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, where it's like, love your mother, your mother, your mother, your mother, and then your father. And you need to respect your parents and love your parents and blah, 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 your parents. And your parents are your gateway to heaven. But it's like, what about my parents and me being their gateway to heaven? What about the opposite? Like, why am I supposed to put my parents on this pedestal? Not that I shouldn't, but like, why am I supposed to when I don't get that reciprocity? What about the ways my parents infringe on me? Why is that never a lecture? Getting to Allah and that relationship with Allah is entirely a purification of the heart. And that purification of the heart simply comes from emotion and how you reconcile your emotions. So why are we so focused on enforcing this power dynamic that it's like your parents are basically on par with getting into heaven? But you just need to figure out a way to get over that barrier of your parents not being perfect human beings. So Reem does something really interesting here. It's a hadith and it's a mentality that we've all heard, this idea that heaven is underneath, particularly your mother's feet. And her concern is, as a result of that, we've understood parents as being perfect beings. So in a sense, she's arguing that this is a form of shirk. We're putting them on par with God. So what if we reimagine this relationship and instead understand children as also being a gateway for parents into Jannah? What happens to the relationship and the power dynamics between parents and children when we reconceptualize the relationship in that way? It's a very provocative and interesting question. So another way that the young Muslim women reformulated Muslimness was speaking for God. That's the category I'm calling it, and creating new cosmogonies or origin stories. So here, Lethen recounts a conversation that she had with her mother, and I'll read that out loud. She's always like, oh, you're such a bad daughter. God is going to punish you, Then I was always like, yeah, you have responsibilities as a mother too, It's not, God is not unfair. It's not one-sided. And so I'm at that space where I can talk back to her. She still doesn't like it, but that's something that I would never have done before. And so I think the combination of just getting more confidence and moving away, just trying new things and sometimes failing, but realizing that's just part of life has really, really helped me. So Lethen, earlier in her story, as she was, telling me, there was a point where she was struggling with thoughts of suicide. She ended up traveling. And for her, it was very important. She talked about traveling without a mahram, and just wanting to feel, instead of feeling all the blame and all the responsibilities for things, she wanted the experience of being able to make mistakes, and accept responsibility on her own terms. And so here, very similar to what Reem was discussing in that last quote, she's talking about a reconfiguration of the relationship between parent and child. So here, her mother was returning from, a khutbah, again, where a lot of these ideas, get echoed and repeated. And she's saying to her daughter, God is going to punish you. And Lethen is saying, both to her mother and perhaps to the broader Muslim community, God is not unfair. It's not one-sided. So again, reconfiguring that relationship was something that a lot of the participants did, which I found very interesting. So similar, Khadija, another Black Muslim woman, very similarly says, and I'll read her quote out loud, I think we're all different. God made us all different, and it's totally okay. Yes, we need to cherish and accept our parents, but we need to cherish and accept ourselves. Because if we are who we are, there's a reason for that. And it's actually, I'm not going to say it's insulting God, but not being yourself or being true to yourself is kind of going against God's will. So I included this quote because, again, it so poignantly demonstrates this comfort in creating new scripts. So here she's really owning and saying you're going against God if you are not true to who you are. And this includes, in an effort to please your parents and perhaps deny certain aspects of yourself. So this was another way that the young Muslim women reconfigured those relationships. Okay, and I'll have another sip. So this quote comes from Nafisa, who's a queer Muslim, and her queerness is really a central tension in her relationship with her mother. She hadn't shared that with her mom, and she really felt that her mother could not fully know her, and thus could not have a relationship where they could teach each other things and relate to each other in a fuller way. So she says here in her quote, if you really believed in God, and here she's talking to the Muslim community broadly, if you really believed in God and believed that God was perfect, that we all come from God, we all return to God, then you would have a much easier time raising a kid and accepting their imperfections and accepting their mistakes rather than trying to control them and trying to fashion them and push down certain parts of them or change certain parts of them or make them be a certain way. You could just be like, wow, isn't that beautiful that God made this perfect person, that they're so different from me? Like what? Think of all the things I could have taught my mom if she knew me. So that's a huge loss for her, I think at the beginning of your life, your parents teach you things. And as you get older, you teach your parents. And when you can't accept your kid, you lose out on those lessons that maybe God put in your kid for you, So again, she really makes it a condition of your faith. And she says here, if you believed in God, then you would accept your child. Putting that forward as something that would have, allowed for a less painful relationship with her mother. Okay. So, consistent across in sort of what these young Muslim women were doing with these hierarchies, right, is removing parents as being a pathway to God and understanding themselves as having independent relationships, both with God and with their parent. And they were able to do this again by recreating those origin stories, speaking for God, in order to, again, have that more direct relationship. Okay. And this is the final long quote. I found this to be, a really nice way to sort of summarize, I think, the argument that I'm trying to make, how the young Muslim women were able to reformulate both Muslimness and therapeutic culture. So here, Idil's making almost a metaphysical argument for the importance of Muslim women having space to think through, these logics of therapy, how they might benefit them in their relationship with their parent, and also how they can retain what they understand to be at the core of their Muslimness. So here she's talking about, again, just space in terms of open, non-judgmental space to, to have support. And she says, and especially Muslim women should have this space, whatever space. Doesn't have to be public, but just to express the feeling that you have, how people treat you, how you expect to be treated. So important, because if they don't exist. They're not there. If Muslim women don't give themselves the gift of speaking about their experiences, there's other younger women and older women who really are going to believe that they are paranoid and that whatever they're feeling is not real. So every time I speak my truth, I know that I participate in rooting another woman in her truth. So here Idil, again, is making this claim not only for herself, but also what she can offer other women. Okay. So in my conclusion, therapeutic culture was used as a resource for textual interpretation by young Muslim women. This practice fits with a genre of Islamic feminism, where Muslim women's lived experiences are centered for textual experience. So this body of research focuses on tools that Muslim women use to navigate what Aisha Chowdhury refers to as, quote, a moment of interruption in the relationship between the text and the believer. So a chief example is Saadia Sheikh's tafsir praxis, where she examines how South African Muslim women reconcile experiences of domestic violence with their personal beliefs about God and justice. Similarly, Juliana Hammer found that North American Muslim domestic violence advocates use an ethic of non-abuse, where they interpret religious texts through their personal understandings of justice. Muslim women's use of civil divorce courts and engagement in public writing, such as blogging, circumvents traditional religious authority and reproduces Muslimness as something that women understand and feel understood by. So my project, which examined therapeutic apologies written by young Muslim women, adds to this literature by demonstrating that therapeutic culture can also be a space where we question Islamic ethics and religious authority. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that extremely informative and beneficial conversation or presentation. I encourage all attendees that if you have questions, please click on the Q&A button and ask your questions there. So I have one question for you, Arij. So the question reads, how would you use therapeutic apologies in cases of addiction and or severe mental illness? For example, psychosis, bipolar, schizophrenia, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me back up and explain a bit about the screening process that I had to do when I was recruiting participants for the study. So individuals had to do a pre-screening interview with me over the phone before we met in person, because as you sort of are alluding to, this is a very emotionally evocative process. Most of the participants cried. I often cried with them because they were talking about very painful memories. So you're absolutely right to point to how would this work if someone has psychosis, which means they don't have, perhaps a grasp of reality, and this might do more harm. So certainly folks who are experiencing psychosis, this would not be a great tool to use. You first, I want to say you want to first have some stability in terms of your sense of reality, your cognition, all of these things. And that's all outlined in the guide. So you can look at that and really see that this is meant to be sort of a middle step. So there's perhaps some pre-work that some folks have to do. And if you are, feeling, stable in certain ways, then this might be an exercise for you. Bipolar disorder is absolutely fine. I had participants who had bipolar disorder. I had folks who had PTSD, depression, anxiety. Yeah, so again, it's a personal thing. So you might want to read the guide and kind of make that decision for yourself, but certainly I would say psychosis. And I think you mentioned addictions. Yes, if you're perhaps struggling with addictions, that was another thing that we pre-screened for, addictions. If you're in a current abusive situation, this is not an ideal process. This is usually maybe after a couple of years of if something's happened and you want to address it, but certainly not something where you're currently being abused by that same person in a very active way. It's not ideal. So I hope that answers your question. If you need clarification, please let me know.
Thank you, Arij. That was very deeply appreciated. That was the only question in the Q&A bar. Again, to all participants and panelists, if you have a question for Arij, this is the time to ask your question. Any questions? So, okay, so I don't.
Sorry, I was about to type it in the chat. It's Nuzhat, but I wanted to go ahead and ask. So, Arij, do you think it would have been a very different type of project if the subjects were Muslim men? Because, yeah, I mean, the reason why I'm asking is because, like one of the quotes, they didn't have access to therapy. They didn't have, other outlets. And even when we get calls from women who are sort of looking for counseling or therapy, they often talk about the fathers, my father won't let me do this. They often talk about the mothers too. But a lot of the times, they're talking about the fathers and the relationships with the father and wanting to leave home because of the father. So I was wondering, what you think about that. And also in your practice, if you weren't doing this with Muslim women, what experiences have you observed or you could share? Because it's an interesting kind of, contrast, as it were.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And there's kind of a few pieces in what you said. So I agree with you. I think it would be harder to recruit Muslim men. And I think that's why I did not even sort of put that out there. I think it would be still very meaningful to them because as we all know, Muslim men are experiencing emotional injuries and complicated relationships with their parents as well. So they, I think, would similarly benefit, but there might be more hesitance to participating in a study like this. So it may need to look a little different, and I'll have to reflect on, what would need to change for it to make sense for them to participate. The other thing that you mentioned that really sparked a thought for me, because you were talking about how it sounded like clients or folks who contact CCMW are really identifying their fathers as being the parent who's emotionally injuring them. What I found so interesting, I wasn't sure, each participant had a choice for which parent they wanted the letter to be from, right? And it was about 50-50. 50% of them chose fathers, 50% chose mothers. That made me happy, because often in psychology, what ends up happening, there's something called mother blame, and mothers were traditionally really blamed for the emotional, problems or suffering of her children. So it sort of flagged to me that that's maybe not the case. But the interesting thing, I would ask them to reflect on, why they chose the parent they did. And for the ones who chose mothers, they would, mention, I'm choosing my mom because she never stood up for me with my dad, so certainly patriarchy, is something that's relevant in these stories. And sometimes, unfortunately, the family dynamic, the way the power works, it is the father who is really wielding it, in very harmful and painful ways. So yeah, that's something that we have to think about, and work on together. And let me know if I missed any part, Nushat, of your question.
No, I think you covered it. Now, Sabrine, you have a whole bunch of questions in the chat box and also in the Q&A.
Yes, we sure do. Okay, Arij, thank you. So we have another question by Sarah Khan, and the question is, what inspired your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the cool thing, if any are sort of folks are interested in learning more about therapy, doing therapy, the thing with emotion-focused therapy is that anything that you will be doing with a client, you first have to do on yourself. So I attended training, had never heard about Therapeutic Apologies. And then suddenly, they put it on the, on the PowerPoint. They're like, this is what we're doing now. So I wrote my letter, from one of my parents, and it was like the floor moved. I had never experienced anything as emotionally evocative. It really made me understand situations very differently. And so because I was so excited about the tool, I introduced it into my practice. And I found it interesting because some of my young Muslim women who I worked with really struggled with the idea of blaming their parents, and I would try to help them distinguish, blaming parents from understanding that something happened to them, something that's lingering and something that, needs some addressing. And so using this tool sort of helped me bridge that. And then I just wanted to understand it more. And I, at the beginning of my presentation, like I talked about, I want to be more critical about the ways we understand Muslim mental health, not that we're just taking things and adopting them, whole, but we're changing them. And we're also being changed by them. So I wanted to understand what that process was. So I hope I've answered your question. Let me know if I, can add more.
Thank you so much, Arij. And I don't mean to just throw so many questions at you, but there's quite a few. So I just want everyone to be able to ask their question. So one question reads, were the themes in the apologies that point out, or were there themes in the apologies that point out to common challenges that face Muslim families?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I did mention, by the way, emotional. And it was interesting because, again, this was in conversation with the women. They would note, okay, there was physical abuse and that was wrong and that's horrible. But the piece that in some ways really lingered longer, was a parent saying to them, you're going to hell. you know, things like that. Really, when it became what we might even call a moral injury, when you're saying to the person, there's something bad about you, you know, and sort of condemning them in that way. So there's a lot of spiritual abuse happening. And what I found so interesting, you know, the young women would also reflect on what resources were available to them at the time. And, you know, they made decisions to protect their families. And of course, we have to understand the context of Islamophobia and how it, you know, it shapes, and anti-Blackness certainly, how it shapes what's available for us. So one of the women talked about being, you know, confined in her home, and the idea of calling the police would just never occur to her. So what a lot of the young Muslim women and the families more generally would do would be to reach out to imams. And actually, I found that to be the most heartbreaking thing. I love the idea that they're going to imams, right? But what I find heartbreaking is how under-resourced imams are and those who are being reached out to. So one of the quotes that will forever stay with me is one of the women talking about, you know, her parents and her went to the imam, talked about what was happening, and the imam actually took her side. And the parents kind of looked at that and were like, okay, she's like done some magic on the imam, even the imam's, you know, agreeing and listening to her. And then the abuse actually escalated after, you know, they went back home. And so she says in her interview, if that imam had followed up, you know, something different might have happened. So I am truly a believer, you know, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If community is going to imams, and if they're going to, you know, folks like that, how do we better resource them so that they are able to follow up? You know, if we can do that, I think we'll have very, very different results. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you so much, Arij. I am going to jump ahead to the next question. So this question is by Noel, and the question reads, are there plans for you to offer or facilitate this process across Canada? Are there more therapists in Canada, such as yourself, with this experience, particularly being Black, Muslim, and woman? Yeah, that is that question.
Oh, that's a good question. So one group that had reached out to me is the Association of American Chaplains. They're interested in being trained in this process. There are no current plans. I think there's a piece you're asking around training. Are others going to be trained in it? I'm very open to it, you know, and perhaps there's a network that we need to build up. Are there many Black Muslim women therapists? I would say no. Yeah, I would say no. Yeah, sadly, inshallah. I think that'll change though, by the way. Like I mentioned, there's that increase 900% in psychological research. Also in terms of folks who are doing training right now to become psychotherapists, I'm getting a lot of people reach out to me who are Black Muslim women. So I think that will change. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you so much, Arij. So one question is by an anonymous attendee, and they ask, how would this therapy work with a person whose siblings copy the parent or inherit the same mannerisms, ways of shouting, abuse, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's a process that you can use actually with anyone. So here I've been talking a lot about, you know, parents, but if there's a sibling, and again, always our priority is for safety, right? Safety and stabilization. And then this is step 2, meaning making, you know, moving forward, those kinds of things. So if safety and stabilization are achieved, you can absolutely get the research guide and write a letter from the perspective of a sibling who perhaps, you know, you feel, you know, needs to apologize to you because they've created some emotional pain. So it can absolutely work. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question reads, Well, first, it was a thank you. So thank you, Arij, for your talk. I am curious what inspired you to use EFFT over narrative techniques, for example.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So narrative techniques being, I'm wondering if you mean like in terms of research or narrative therapy. So those are two different things. I'm not trained in narrative therapy. I understand it, my exposure to it, I understand it as being, it's usually a life writing across the lifespan, whereas EFFT, they really talk about it as being almost like surgery without a scalpel. It's so pointed. I find it to be very, very effective. Again, once you establish, that comfort with your therapist, that person who's, doing this work with you, and there's that feeling of safety and trust, you can really touch on some really, significant moments. So I guess that's why. But perhaps I'll do some narrative training at some point. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you. What were the self-identified levels of religiosity of the women in the study? Did these change throughout the process?
Ooh, that's interesting. Was that the complete question, Sabrina? I might have cut you off. Yeah.
No, that was a complete question.
Thank you. These are really good questions. Yeah. So yeah, I would say it was across the scope. I had a couple folks who identify as cultural Muslims, and then some folks who would describe themselves as being quite conservative. So it's interesting that you ask if there was a change, because again, because this is such a cross section, this is such a limited engagement, I would have expected no. But actually, I recall one of the women, and I shared that quote from Nafisa, who's talking about if you really believe in God, so, putting conditions on your belief on God, is someone who described herself as being culturally Muslim, but then throughout the interview really demonstrated to me that there was perhaps a deeper, a spiritual attachment to her Muslimness, that she was able to articulate. So I won't claim that there was a change, but there was certainly more nuance, and I think some layers were really revealed throughout our conversation. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
Thank you, Arij. So in the chat box, there's a question by Marissa, and the question is, do you think these results would have been different with women who did not have previous therapy experience? And what differences did you notice between the participants who did and did not have previous experience?
Yeah, so I was really expecting that there would be a big difference between the two groups of folks who have done some therapy and folks who haven't. But because therapeutic culture, as that beautiful quote from Cyrus Zargar suggests, it's like the air that we breathe. We all use this language. It's a way of thinking that we've all adopted. So there was actually not a ton of difference, because whether they participated formally in therapy, they've been exposed to these ideas. They've read these books, they've watched Oprah. There's lots of sort of resources and spaces where these ideas are articulated. So it's so dominant that I don't think actually there's a huge difference. By the way, it's even now in schools, right? Now, schools are expected to, teach students about vulnerability and emotional literacy. So it's sort of, it's just dominant, it's everywhere. So there wasn't a big difference.
Thank you very much. There was a question from Facebook, and that question is, how did you address patriarchy in these sessions? Did any of the results shock or surprise you?
Yeah, interesting question. So I'm curious what you mean by address patriarchy. Like, because I have a Black feminist decolonial lens, I'm always considering it. As far as did things shock me, it's interesting because a lot of people would ask me as a social worker and psychotherapist, how do you handle, stories and things like that. And I have to say, this was the first time that I had to actually develop a self-care practice, because a couple of the stories, and because I had to read them multiple times and, analyze them, would be very, very difficult to revisit. So I, I'm a big fan now of Epsom salt baths. Those I find those very relaxing. Taking care of yourself is very, very important. Some can be quite heavy. And I won't sort of say what they were, as to not, again, just kind of, harm anyone. So, yeah.
Thank you, Arij. Another question from Facebook asks, will you recommend parents to use your techniques to write a letter so that they can avoid verbal abuse?
I would love if parents, actually, I always vision that. You just reminded me, when I was starting this project, that was always phase 2. I'm like, okay, first I'm going to talk with, the children. Next, I want to go and talk to parents and support them in writing their letters to children and reading them aloud to empty chairs. And the reason I really want to do that is because, like I mentioned earlier, there's strong research that shows for parents who have children with disordered eating, which is, by the way, one of the most difficult disorders to treat. It's very treatment resistant. They found that parents, in doing therapeutic apologies in combination with emotion coaching and behavior coaching, were able to decrease their feelings of self-blame and fear, because those feelings were interfering in them, in their ability to support their child, So once they were able to kind of name what was going on and apologize to their child for whatever it is the parent was holding, parents were able to interrupt their child's symptoms. So they were able to say to their child, you need to eat, and it's a very challenging thing to do. I would love to. Actually, that's my passion. I loved working with parents earlier when I was working at a hospital. They're the most sort of vulnerable folks. There's no need for getting any buy-in with them, because I really do believe all parents, as painful as it might be for some of us to believe, I do believe that there's a part of them that really wants what's best for their child. So if we can, support them and see what's getting in their way, I think we can, do some really good work.
Thank you, Arij. Afua says thank you and asks, what do you hope to do with this research?
Okay, so it's a great question. So many good questions. So I should mention there's a podcast, and I may have mentioned it. 7 of the 17 women agreed with me to use their interviews and share them. So my hope, and this is language that comes from emotion-focused therapy, there's something called vicarious processing. So sometimes just in hearing someone else's story and them doing something really emotionally evocative, like an apology, when we're safe and stable, it can really help us process our own emotions. So yeah, it kind of relates to a question that was asked earlier. I would love to support, a network where maybe there is training, for folks to use these kinds of things. And again, supporting parents, I think, in better resourcing imams. That's a big mission of mine as well. So there's a lot of pieces that I'm interested in. And yeah, inshallah, if anyone wants to collaborate, by the way, if there's interest, please, you have my email, get in touch, and inshallah, we can, do our best. Oh, Afua Cooper. Wow, inshallah. Okay. I just saw the chat note. Yeah.
Thank you. So what about Muslim women who wouldn't want to go to Muslim social workers or psychotherapists?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's about the goodness of fit. I've had, other conversations, so not a part of this research, where person actually preferred working, where there's a little bit of cultural distance. So yeah, there's no hard or fast rule. It's just about, asking. You can get those 15-minute, often free phone consultations, and you can ask questions like, can you tell me, about the things that you really are priorities for you? Can you tell me about your approach? How do you, how do you overcome if there are cultural differences or things that you're not understanding? Try to get a sense of their style, their experience of maybe working with groups that are important for you that you might identify with. So you don't have to work with the same community members. So it's certainly up to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Arij. So it looks like we're at the end of the questions. Thank you. I know I've been just throwing so many questions at you, so thank you for answering all of them. We do see that someone named NAS has their hand up. If you have a question, would you like to write it in the Q&A box or in the chat box? And we also just got another question. Sorry, Arij, you're very popular, but the question reads, how would you use this technique to help with harm reduction?
Okay, so harm reduction usually relates to substance abuse. So again, this would not be an ideal process, and this is I'm really relying on what the research has said. So I'm not the one who's sort of decided that. That's what folks who have developed therapeutic apologies have suggested. So yeah, I don't have an answer, right? It's about if you're beyond a stage of needing to get safety and stability, and you're in a space where you're ready to make meaning, then it's an ideal process. And I have more about that in the guide. So talking about it in the context of trauma, so that might be helpful if you want to look at that. And if you have any other questions, you have my email.
Thank you so much. I guess this is just a final call. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box or the Q&A box. Thank you so much, Arij. It looks like that is it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your questions, your participation. Thank you for being here on a Friday night. And someone had reminded me it's a long weekend. So it says a lot about your curiosity and interest. And I'm so glad to have shared this space with all of you.
So don't go away yet, Arij. There's a little bit more left.
Okay.
Okay. I think we have Mariam up next. So thank you so much. That was an amazing, very stimulating presentation. And of course, the questions were equally great. But I'm going to now call on Mariam to do her bit. Mariam?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My video is not working. I'm not sure if someone can enable that for me.
I'm not sure. Sorry, Mariam.
No, it's okay.
Iman, can you make her co-host?
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there, got it.
There we go. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Thank you so much for speaking tonight. Yes, just like we mentioned earlier, it's a long weekend. So thank you everyone for coming out. My name is Amer Bagasra. I am the fundraising officer with CCMW. So as everyone knows, CCMW stands for Empowerment, Equality, and Equity for Canadian Muslim Women. And we are asking for your support. This year's Women Who Inspire and Leila Feldman Scholarship presentations will be held via Zoom on November 14th from 1 to 3 p.m. So please mark that in your calendars. This scholarship is named after the late Dr. Leila Feldman, our founder of CCMW. Donations will go to women who are enrolled in a full-time undergraduate or certificate program at a Canadian college or university. Last year, we had amazing results from fundraising for the program. While we set a modest goal of $5,000, we were able to, alhamdulillah, successfully raise over $22,000. We'll be launching the event next week. Please make sure to purchase a ticket to the event. Proceeds will go towards the scholarship fund. If you cannot attend the event, please consider making a donation to support us. Thank you.
Thank you.
If
Mariam.
anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Mariam.
Thank you.
And now, Sabrine, to you for thank you and closing dua.
Of course, and I don't mean to be, I don't mean to do this, but I do see just one last question in Arij. I just wonder if I can just quickly throw that question at you. Is that okay, Arij? Yeah, okay. So the question reads, from Nazra, I had depression and mental illness 30 years ago. Do you think there was lack of love and affection?
Okay. And what was the name? Sorry, Nazra?
Nazra, yes.
Yeah, so Sister Nazra, I mean, that's a complicated thing, right? Because depression and anxiety can show up for a lot of different reasons. So it sounds like for you, you know, you're wondering if there might have been at the root of that, you know, not feeling loved or affection. So I don't have an answer, but it's certainly something, you know, you can explore, and you can email me, and, you know, I don't know, I can share resources with you. So sorry, I don't have a better answer.
No, I think that was perfect. So thank you. And if anyone has questions, NAS and others, if you have more questions for Arij, please do write it in the chat box. And I'm sure, Arij, you could follow up with them. So again, I thank you for such an excellent presentation. So many people in the chat box have reiterated the same thing, that they have learned so much from you and they appreciate you. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who took the time to be here. And we can say our closing dua. This is an excerpt from the Quran pertaining to justice, and it reads, indeed, Allah orders justice and good conduct in giving to relatives and forbids immortality and bad conduct and oppression. Another one I wanted to read was, O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. So thank you again, Arij. Thank you to all, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.